good morrow, of course.
Of course.
You said I strip naked and dive in, which is partly true, but sometimes I put on my tricorn hat and dive in. So I'm going to wear the tricorn hat.
I have to be honest, I was hoping you had the hat.
I figure I got to get in the mindset.
History, I'd like to follow me down the rabbit hole. History, I'd like to, frankly, I want to know.
Hi, and welcome to HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck, where history is a party and everybody's coming. I'm your host, Dawn Brody. And as I record this, it is the summer of 2024, and we're only a few months away from the presidential election, and shit is tense. Okay, we seem to be determining not just who will be the next president, but what will be the fate of our Constitution. Yeah, now if you're being cynical, the Constitution, hey, it's just a 230 plus year old piece of parchment. It's got 4,500 words rendered by 55 white guys, many of whom owned human beings. Yeah, and if you're being sanctimonious, you're like, no, the Constitution is our country's beating heart, man. And as the supreme law of the land, it has actually buttressed the freest civic assemblage of people ever to have existed. Yeah? And regardless of where you fall between these two perspectives, we can agree on this. It's all about to change. Okay, because after November, man, we could have a larger Supreme Court, a more king-like president. We, the people, may enjoy more rights, less rights, no electoral college, no elections at all. Now, you can choose not to care about the Super Bowl, okay? You can ignore Taylor Swift, but you can't do that with the Constitution, man. She's in bed with you, baby. She's in your fridge and your faucet and your lungs and your uterus and your beer and your gun and your school and your, right? You get it. It's scary. And I have the best possible guest to discuss this. And he is hot right now, guys. He's a big deal, all right? He was on CBS This Morning and The Daily Show in just a couple days prior to recording with me, right? A.J. Jacobs is a writer and humorist known for his immersive dedication to a variety of subjects. Like while examining outsourcing in the workplace, for example, he outsourced his entire life for a month. Like seriously, like a guy in India even argued with his wife for him. He then spent a year attempting to follow every rule in the Bible and wrote a New York Times bestseller, The Year of Living Biblically. Now, his latest book, My Year of Living Constitutionally, just came out, and it is funny and smart, and get this, really optimistic. I know, right? Let's get started.
First, I love the intro, and also I love what you said. The Constitution is everywhere, in our beer, in our books, in our I don't have a uterus, but in my whatever I have, my testes, right?
I mean, you have jumped into a subject. I mean, the Constitution can be so dry. People talk about it as this like boring parchment. I mean, you have infused so much real life into this thing. It was such a joy to read. Like, I mean, when I gave that list, it's because I feel like when I was reading your book, everywhere I looked, I was like, amendment, Constitution, amendment.
Right.
When it's crazy, man.
Well, I love that framing because that's exactly why I wrote the book. I read a couple of years ago a statistic that 60% of Americans have never read the Constitution from start to finish. I was in that 60%. And by the way, I think 60% is pretty generous. I think, it's going to be 80, 90%. But as you say, like every day, the news, it's on the front page. It determines our lives, where we go to school, what we can do with our bodies, what we can carry. So I was like, I want to understand it. And as you mentioned, I like to understand things by immersing myself in them. And I wanted to create sort of a crash course on the Constitution that would be entertaining for hopefully me and for the readers. So I decided to live it by, I did everything from carrying an 18th century musket around New York City because that's my Second Amendment right. I gave up social media in favor of writing pamphlets with a quill pen. I quartered soldiers in my New York apartment. And it was absurd. It was an absurd at many times, but also fascinating because I did get to dive into these issues. How should we interpret this foundational document? How does it affect our lives? And how can we keep democracy going?
And your immersion into it too is so illuminating to you and to us, and it shines a light on one of, I think, the prevailing things that you bring not only to this book but to your previous, which is a real humility. I mean, you manage to balance this line of humility, which is, I've never read the Constitution. Hey guys, I'm with you. I'm going to go ahead and read it first, and then live every day of my life for the next year tethered to the tenets. It's such a humble yet ambitious thing to do. And it makes you so endearing and so optimistic that as you read it, doesn't matter where you are approaching it. A strict originalist or someone who's like, fuck this, these slave owners wrote this garbage. You just know that your curiosity and humility are going to be such an excellent vehicle.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, because I did try to go in with deep curiosity instead of an axe to grind. But, and I actually think that's a very founding father virtue. And by the way, of course, founding, we don't want to go back to the 18th century. It was smelly. It was racist, sexist. Cutting edge medicine was the tobacco smoke enema, where they literally blew smoke up your ass. That was supposed to be good for your stomach and all. But there are virtues, and one of them is what you just said. Ben Franklin was really good at exhibiting humility. And at the Constitutional Convention, he said two things that I love. The first was, he said, the older he gets, the less certain he is of his own opinions. And I'm getting old, so I'm trying to follow that because it's easy to go the other way and become entrenched. And then the other thing, he was like you, he was a bit of a jester, a joker. And he told a parable, like a little jokey parable at the convention. He said, there's this French lady, and she says to her sister, it's so weird. Why am I the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue? And his point was, we're all that French lady. We all think we're correct on everything, and we're not. So let's have some humility and look at things with a little more openness and curiosity.
Absolutely. And it renders, I think, the whole community so much better off. I mean, the other thing that you talk about taking from this early part of the Constitution is the idea of a general welfare. And that it isn't just good for you personally to admit that you can be wrong sometimes, but it makes your society a better place. Like you owe it, you owe it to yourself for your own mental health, and you owe it to your neighbors to be able to be like, I fucked that one up. Sorry
that
about
is so good. Yes, that's a great point. It is like your civic duty to say, I make mistakes. And the Constitution itself was all about they knew it was imperfect, and they built in this mechanism to change it with amendments. But the problem is, they didn't see this two-party system coming, which makes it so hard to change. But it is on the one hand, it's an amazing, beautiful document, inspiring. But as you say, it's got mistakes. I actually, as part of this, I ran it through Grammarly software, the Constitution, and Grammarly found 600 mistakes. 600. So some of them were because it was old, but some were like ITS when it should be IT''S, which would get flamed on Twitter. They misspelled Pennsylvania. They two different ways. They spelled it PENN on page 1 and PENS on page 4. So in 4 pages, So it's not perfect. They knew it was not perfect. They wanted us to try to make it more perfect, but it's so hard to do in this intransigent, polarized situation we've got.
Oh my gosh. And I wonder if having approached the Bible first made you more or less prepared for how the rest of the world and your country in particular approach these documents with an increasingly similar amount of sanctity. Right?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was I mean, you nailed it. I consider this the sequel to my book on the year of living biblically, because that book was all about how literally do we take the Bible. When it says that you should grow a beard, you can't shave the corners of your beard. What does that mean? I decided to be safe and let the whole thing grow, and I looked like, Gandalf.
I thought it looked great. I liked your beard phase.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm going to tell my wife, because she did not.
And speaking of which, Julie, I feel like I fell in love with you, and I'm a huge fan of you in reading your books. I watched your TED Talks. I mean, it was great. I watched early aughts AJ talking. It was really fun. But just for sure, my crush is firmly on Julie, your wife, who she's not fucking diving into all this stuff, and she's just got to live with her husband, who now has a long ass beard and won't sit on the chairs she sat on because she's menstruating.
Exactly. Yes, she is a hero. I'm glad I'm contractually obligated to say that, but it's true. She like you said, the Bible says you cannot, in Leviticus, that if a woman is menstruating and she sits on a seat, then the seat becomes impure. So Julie read that, was offended, and decided to sit in every seat in our apartment while she was menstruating. So I spent the whole year standing, or I actually bought a little portable chair that I was the only one allowed to sit on. So yes, she did the same sort of thing with the Constitution book, because 19th and 18th century, as you may or may not know, I think not a great time for women. It was.
You don't say.
Yeah, I know. It's a shocker. And there was something called coverture. That was the legal standing for women in most states, which basically children. They treated women like children, especially when you were married.
Especially married, yeah.
Yeah, weirdly, you lost rights when you were married.
Sure.
So women, of course, couldn't vote, but they couldn't sign contracts. The men had to sign contracts. And I said, well, I'm trying to live constitutionally in this mindset. I guess she owns a business where she signs several contracts a day. So I said, I brought it up, like, maybe I should be the one signing the contracts. Now, at first, she said, great. I hate doing this paperwork. And she handed it over to me. I made such a mess of it, because I am financially illiterate, that she fired me after an hour. So that coverture in my house did not last long.
It didn't. And you had really good compromises, I thought, that you laid out for the reader, where you were like, look, I'm not going to share my pipe. And I'm not going to have communal. I'm going to go ahead and get vaccinated this year. I'm going to stay. And
true.
You watch TV and you watch movies, but you tended to stick to an 18th century theme. You watch a lot of John Adams, I imagine.
I watched that. I watched Turn. And I did use the internet to buy my 18th century stuff. So I bought all of my beef tallow candles over the internet, and this hat that you see. So that was... I sort of compromised. I tried to,
Which is so
best.
Constitutional. Compromise, I mean, right?
Great
That's
point.
the beating.
Great. I'm going to use that spin. Thank you, Dawn.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
You're good at rationalizing.
Ooh. You know how it is. You got a 6-year-old. You got to find your way out of all your particulars. Well, here's what I'd like to do, and it's also per your book, is you talk about, in the Year of Living Biblically and this one, you talk about the importance of cherry picking and that some people consider it such a negative connotation, but that what's wrong with cherry picking if you're just picking the best fruit, man.
Thank you for saying exactly. Right. And same with cafeteria religion is considered this sort of negative. Oh, you're just picking the parts of the Bible you like about being kind to neighbors, and you're not picking the parts about how homosexuality is a sin. Listen, what's wrong with cafeterias? I mean, I've had great meals, so you should. That's our job, is to pick things. Yeah.
How else are you going to get pad thai and cheesecake on your tray? In the same meal, if you aren't in it,
Which is very American to have this combination, yeah.
It is, and also very founding fathers constitutional to look to nature for examples of how things work, and they weren't aware of it at the time, but does not nature select? Right. Cherry pick. You don't get webbed feet anymore. I know it was great, but you don't get, now we're going to take the webbed feet, but we're going to give you these great lungs.
That is brilliant. Yeah, because nature is all about evolution.
Right.
And that is the way I like to look at the Constitution and the Bible. I try to present both sides, because there is the originalism side in the Constitution who says that you have the most important thing when looking at the Constitution, original meaning. What did it mean to the public when 1789? And their argument is a solid one. They say, imagine if you hired a contractor to put in a new sink, and then he finishes and you've got a chandelier in the bathroom and a couch and a washing machine. And he said, it's an evolving contract. I just decided to do what I want. So there's a danger of that. But on the other hand, there's the living constitutionalists or pragmatists. They have different names. And they say, no, this was written, as you say, 240 years ago. We live in a very different time, both technologically and morally. And so the Constitution has to evolve. We have to change the meaning, that it can't be just about where the train came from, but also where's the train now? Where is it going?
Oh, it's so great. You also had one that was about a ship, I think, the blueprints to a ship. And that once you put it in the water, if it starts to sink, you change the plans, and now the boat has floated for 240 years and it's floating, and then someone comes in and goes, oh no, we must go back to the original blueprints of this boat. You're like, bitch, it'll sink.
Exactly. And that was Larry Kramer, was the one, Stanford law professor, came up with that analogy. And I love it. Yeah, exactly. So we are on a ship where we're changing it as it goes, and we can't go back, or else, as you say, we'll sink. Our country will sink.
There was yet another metaphor I thought you used to explain how the Constitution worked that I found myself, I underlined it in the book. And to your point, you said you use a quill. I hand wrote my notes for this episode. I didn't use a quill and an ink, but I did use the notepad, which is sort of primitive for me. And I enjoyed some of the experience that you described, which is just that slowing down of your thoughts and completion of an idea. And it was great. And I remember underlining it and marking it and then writing it down on the thing. And it stuck with me since, which was that you described the Constitution as like the instructions for a really complicated yet fun game. And it's funny, as I'm talking to you too, I can see over your shoulder, you've got a whole stack of board games. And my family too, we're like, we love board games and, Settlers of Catan and Villainous and Ticket to Ride. And my husband loves games too, but he hasn't played them his whole life. So there is that moment, I watch it happen to him. When we bring out a new game and he's very excited and everyone's told him this game is great and so much fun. And then the booklet comes out. And it's little print and it's lots of pages, and it's this: if one player has only 2 pieces on the board and you go clockwise, then the next player, and I see his eyes start to get glazed over and his face starts to fall and he's nodding because it's so hard. And you said, this is, some people, when they get to the Constitution, it's that just like, here comes the tedium. I'm not going to be able to remember it. And also knowing that if you don't know them, you're subject to other people who do know them telling you if you're playing it correctly or not. So it's, you don't want to admit that you didn't understand anything that everyone's just said, because then they'll take advantage of you. And it also speaks to that literalist or originalist living constitutionalist, because like we play, for example, Settlers of Catan, where we had changed some of the rules because we got to go to bed. We can't play all night. Sometimes this game takes, so many hours and we got to get to bed. So the rule says this, but fuck that rule because it takes too long, And then you take your game to your friend's house to play Settlers of Catan, right? And they say to you, perhaps, if they're originalists, you're not even playing the same game.
Right. I love that riff. Thank you. Basically, the Constitution has several parts. So the preamble is this incredibly inspiring 52 words about the general welfare, blessings of liberty. It's like, oh my God, you want to stand up. And then it gets to the articles, which are exactly like what you said, like rules to the president gets to roll the dice, then it's Congress's turn. But I think your point about house rules is good because you got to look at the big picture. For games, the big picture is let's have a good time. Let's have fun. So if that means agreeing on a tweak of the rules so we can go to bed before 2, that's fine. So what is the purpose of the Constitution? The purpose of the Constitution is to create a more perfect nation, to increase the general health, happiness, and welfare. And if that means changing stuff, that's fine, and that's American. They wanted it to change.
Yeah. And one of the things I'd love for you to tell me about is your advisors, because you, from what we said from the beginning, we're like, I don't know a lot about this, and I'm going to need help, especially when interpreting, that you had advising you some deeply entrenched originalists and some very, on the far end of the other, the very living constitutionalists. Tell me about that, how you selected / found your advisors and how you utilized them throughout.
Yeah. Well, for all my books, I go in knowing I need help. So with the Bible, I had a whole board of spiritual advisors, rabbis and ministers and priests and scholars, atheists. And for this one, I was like, I need historians, I need law professors, and I got some amazing ones like Lawrence Tribe from Harvard, who's sort of the top of the top. And like you said, from all over, I wanted the super liberal who think the Constitution is just Play-Doh for us to mold whatever we want, and then the hardcore originalist. One guy on my team of advisors won't use a capital S when he's writing the Supreme Court, because in the Constitution, it's a lowercase s. And I actually like that because the Supreme Court has gotten way too powerful.
That's weird.
So, yeah. And I was so glad that they took the time to talk to me and explain things over and over again. But it allowed me, in the book, I really do try to present both sides. In the end, I find living constitutionalism has more benefits than originalism as an approach. But I want to give people, I think it's an American, to show them the balance, to show them both sides. The phrase straw manning, I like the phrase steel manning, where you present the other side in the strongest possible way. So strong that if you're a reader, you don't even know at the start, like, which side is it on. In the end, I make it clear, but I did want to present both sides, because otherwise, it's just, we never get anywhere if we just turn the other side into cartoons.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the beautiful parts of the way that you approach it in your book, in that you deeply immersed. You're going to live this every day. You're going to go article by article and amendment by amendment, but you don't skip the fun ones, and you don't try to gloss over the absurd ones. And there's a couple in particular that are so fantastic. My personal favorite is when you quartered a soldier, which is certainly not an obligation. That part of the Third Amendment was that you don't have to. But you can. You certainly can. And you met Arjun. Can you tell the listeners about how you met Arjun and what it was like quartering a soldier in your home?
Of course. And as you said, quartering a soldier is the Third Amendment. So you've got free speech, freedom to bear arms, and then you don't have to quarter a soldier. And quarter does not mean chop into 4 parts, just to clarify.
You can't do that no matter what.
Yeah, that is definitely against. But this means before the Revolutionary War, the British would force the colonists to house the soldiers, turn them into unwilling Airbnbs for the British soldiers. And that really pissed off the Americans, and they said never again. So that is why it's so high up. It's number 3. And it says you don't have to quarter a soldier without your consent. But I thought, with my consent, it's actually a nice early American thing to do. They were very into hospitality and letting people stay. So at first we tried, it was very hard to find a soldier to quarter. I did all sorts.
It wouldn't be so hard for me, AJ. Girl,
Well,
you gotta try. You ain't tried hard enough.
I could have used your help, Dawn. I really could have, because me, yes, as a not particularly attractive 50-something guy, I tried Craigslist. I went to these sailors in Times Square and offered them my apartment. I finally got one through a friend of a friend, and he was great. Arjun, he came to stay for about, I would have had him for longer, but my wife, Julie, said 3 days is enough of soldier quartering. But it was fascinating we talked about serious issues like the civilian military divide, which I think is a problem in our country because we're each in our bubbles. And a lot of people don't even know someone in the Army, which is a new thing. That is not something from American history before. It was like much more mixed.
Yeah, it was fascinating. There was also a moment where y'all go out to eat, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you go out to early American food, or kind of the closest you could find to sort of colonial American food. And Arjun was an Indian immigrant. You are an agnostic Jew going out for early American food, and he asks for Mexican seasoning. And you were like,
right. I thought that was very American, the whole melting pot. So, yes.
Wow, what a moment. What a cross-section.
It was very nice. And we also did some early American toasts when we drank our Madeira, which was their favorite booze. One of their favorite toasts was freedom from mobs as well as kings, because they had an interesting, back then, on the one hand, the Constitution was, as some say, the big bang of democracy. It was this huge new, like, people being allowed to choose their leader. On the other hand, they had this elitist, oligarchic, slavocratic side. And so it was a very much a mixture of these two things. And I now see a lot of American history as the battle between these two strands of elitism in the Constitution, fear of the mobs, fear of the hoi polloi having too much power, and then fear of a tyrant. So on the other hand.
It's, one of those things we were talking about, how we see history through our own personal lives. And I've always felt like this generally politically, that hard lines are generally not my lines, and I tend to find any sort of absolutionist perspective, I tend to be cynical about. But it's been really brought into focus as a mom, because if such absolute instructions were helpful, then I could say to my daughter, you never talk to a stranger, period.
Right.
And that would be the end of it. But we live in a very friendly neighborhood. So now I already have a little asterisk. Unless it's someone that is a friend of your teacher who's coming to visit your school for the first time. I mean, name the amendments that then I would have to put after that. You never, you find there are so few absolutes when you're just trying to tell a human being whom you love more than any other human being how to navigate within this world. You go, oh no. Oh, it depends, honey. It's complicated. Use your gut, use your reason, listen to what other people say, but also be ready to ignore what everyone says. I, your mother, can be wrong. It's rare, but it happens. I get wrong information. I misread what has happened. I try to apologize when those things happen, and I try to point out, oh, I didn't understand that. I'm so sorry. Because, and I feel like if that is the truth within my home, then how could I look at we even call them our fathers, we use this language for a reason, that it is such a great, to your point about original, it's such a wonderful start.
Right. Well, first of all, I think you're a great mom. I love what you say about admitting you're wrong. So.
Thank you.
Welcome to My Life in 3 Songs. My name is Christine Blackburn, and I am so excited to share with you my brand new podcast exclusively on Spotify. Listen to comedians talking about 3 songs that have impacted their lives. Not necessarily their favorite songs, but songs that are attached to strong memories that paint a picture of their life.
And I can remember being a little kid and opening up this album. And then this song became something that as a teenager was like an anthem to me.
And I just remember so vividly the song coming on, and that's where I find myself on. I see myself on the road. I felt very vital at this point in my life.
These songs are very important to me at certain points in my life. I'm 10 years old. My brother buys this album. Turns out I've adopted them as my favorite band.
Check out the show on Instagram and Twitter at My Life in 3 Songs, and of course the website, mylifein3songs.com. My Life in 3 Songs is exclusively on Spotify. Rock on.
Now, before we return to tickling your amendments, a moment to enumerate my favorite articles. My patrons. The latest to pledge their sacred honor and a few bucks a month include Sarah D., Emily F., Scott G., Ann T., and Justin W. Now, these founding mamas and daddies put their John Hancocks to my sacred parchment, and in return, I provide for the general welfare, ensuring that the history keeps coming and coming and coming. Now, if you'd like to make our union more perfect and hear your own shout out here next time, check out the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/hilfpodcast. Then to social media and
Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow.
you genuinely and vigorously pursued a letter of marque.
That's
was
true.
One of the times where I hit myself. I put my hand over my chest so hard, and I put the other hand up in the air, and I think I may have even said your name. Oh, AJ. Because, it's my personal dream to be a pirate. I lived on a boat for years, and I always said, I was like, technically, if you commit a crime on the boat, technically you're a pirate. Like,
did you shoplift anything?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think I drank bootlegged liquor.
Wow,
among many
you're a pirate.
Public nudity is an easy one.
That is awesome.
Tell us about meeting the, I want to make sure, Ro Khanna, meeting Ro Khanna, the representative who genuinely and I think very pleasantly advised you on how you might be able to do this.
Yes, I loved this project because I got to delve into some parts of the Constitution as if they could have been written today. They're almost timeless. The blessings of liberty, the common welfare, but there are parts that are very 18th century, and you're like, oh my God. And one of those is that the Congress, as a citizen, you have the constitutional right to become a pirate, a government-sanctioned pirate. I mean, they're really called privateers, and they were incredibly important in U.S. history because during the Revolution, we didn't have much of a navy. So we outsourced it. We said to fishermen and whalers, if you put some muskets on your boat and go chase down British ships, you can keep the booty. You get to keep the
make it hard
sherry
for them. Yeah, throw some wrenches in their fan, man. Whatever slows them down.
That's it. Exactly. We need your help. So this is in the Constitution, and it has not been used since 1815, but it's still in there. The right to get a letter of marque and reprisal, which is the letter that says it's your permission to be a pirate. But I thought, well, I'm trying to be this ultimate originalist. Let me be the first since 1815 to try to get a letter of marque.
Yes.
And I went and I met with Ro Khanna, who is a congressman from California. We met at a hotel in New York. And I said, I'm really interested in getting this thing from the Constitution. And at first he was like, great, let's make it happen. And then he said, what is it again? And then I explained to him what it was about being a pirate. And then he became a little less enthusiastic, a little more skeptical, like, wait, I'm not sure. So you would go to the Taiwan Strait and in your friend's water ski boat. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it.
You're reading it exactly right, Ro.
But he actually liked the idea of the book, which was to explore the Constitution and how we should interpret it. So he did bring it up with some fellow Congress people, but it has yet to get the majority approval of the Congress. I'm still waiting. His assistant I love because he'll email me occasionally and call me Captain. So Captain Jacobs. So that's the closest I can get to. But I did love it. I mean, it was, first of all, just from a historical point of view, learning about these privateers who are unsung heroes of the Revolution. We would not have a country without them because they captured nearly 2,000 British boats, and they are very unknown. And I think part of it is because they had this. It's kind of messy. They weren't purely fighting for freedom. They were also profit motive. They wanted the booty. They wanted their. But as one of my advisors pointed out, the whole birth of America is messy. It is ugly. You know, you've got the stain of slavery. You've got a lot. It is not an immaculate conception. But that said, that doesn't mean we should just give up. You know, we can still look at the highest ideals that they had back then and try to perfect them.
Well, totally. And there was also, not among all privateers, of course, but in a lot of pirate crews, there was a certain democracy that predates ours. They're articles of the Gentlemen of Fortune and the rules that pirates followed within their own times, that you were not allowed to fight on the boat. All of these things were like reflective, I think, in a lot of our founding documents, that this is a dangerous enterprise. We are all in this unknown, dangerous enterprise, but to many, we are simply criminals in a criminal enterprise. And perhaps, therefore, it is more important that we have a strict rules that we follow among ourselves, or we will be in the chaos they predict for us.
Interesting. Yeah. I know. I had read something about the democracy of pirates. That is fascinating. But I agree with you. Like, they were taking a mind-boggling risk. They would have been hanged if they had lost the war. And they were going up against the greatest military force. I mean, there's the famous John Adams said at the Revolution that 1/3 of the citizens were patriots, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 were neutral. And I always think I'd probably be in that neutral side. I'd be like, I'll pay another couple of cents for my tea. I mean, I don't want to die.
All of our mamas, for the most part, were born in England, right?
Exactly.
And also there was also an argument. The loyalists were saying, look, our English king just saved our ass in this French and Indian War. That's part of the reason why we're paying these taxes, is because they took care of it. That it was there was a mutual benefit there, was sort of separate. And the tarring and feathering and really brutal acts of terrorism that the patriots were inflicting on loyalists is hard to defend,
No, I know it is. I as part of this, I joined the New Jersey reenactment 3rd Regiment.
I love these guys.
They were the best
so much.
And at one of the battles, I met a loyalist, and I said, why did you choose to be a loyalist and faithful to the king instead of playing the part of the patriot? And he said, well, my great-great-great-grandfather was a loyalist. And here's what happened. This is his side of the story. Was he was a farmer and he wasn't interested in politics. He just said, leave me alone. I just want to do my farming. The Patriots, this was before the Constitution, so there really were no limits. And they came and they said, either you join us or we're going to burn your farm down. He said, no, I'm not joining you. They burned his farm down. They put him in jail. And then the loyalists broke him out of jail, and he's like, well, these guys broke me out. The other guys burned my farm down. I guess I'm going to join them. So it was a complicated thing. I mean, in the end, I'm super glad that we got independence. But at the time, it must have been much more complicated from the point of view of the average citizen.
Oh, absolutely. And even among the people who agreed, I mean, those divisions, once you then just get all of the patriots in one room together, even thence, you have drastic disagreement, right?
Totally. Well, that was one of the most interesting things researching was this, how we all think, oh, the founding fathers, they were a monolith. They all had the same thoughts. No. I mean, one of my favorite arguments at the convention was the idea of how do we structure the presidency?
Oh, yes.
That was so interesting because when one of the delegates proposed, well, let's have a single president, a lot of the other delegates said, are you jesting? That's a terrible idea. That is terrible.
They call those kings, you dummy. Yeah.
Exactly. We just shed blood to get rid of them. And now you're saying an elected king? This is a terrible idea. They said, we'll get a council of presidents, 3 presidents, 12 presidents. And it was a hard-fought battle for weeks. And finally, 7 states voted for the single president. 3 states still said no. And so that's why we have a single president. But one of the arguments was, I think it was Edmund Randolph, who said, a single president is the fetus of monarchy, that it'll just grow and grow and grow in power. And I have to say, he's got a point. I mean,
it's tough to look around.
Right. And this was even before the Supreme Court ruled on the immunity. You had George Washington gave 8 executive orders in his 8 years. Obama and Trump both gave more than 200 in their respective terms. So this was already, we had sort of an imperial presidency. And now with the immunity, I mean, my line is it's not a fetus anymore. It's like a teenager. We got a teenager on our hands. Ooh. Teenager of monarchy. So I am all for, I think it should be a bipartisan issue that we need to control the president. It is not American. It's kingly, it's royal, it's monarchical. Let's get back to giving Congress more power. That was what the framers wanted.
In your book, you talk about specifically the no kings was so pervasive that it was so integral to the minutia of the way they thought and spoke that after the signing of the Constitution, they changed street names. No, this is no longer King Street. This is Congress Street. They changed the names of colleges, and innocuous recipes were no longer called the Kings because it was just so. That is the singular, most specific thing that we have changed in our political life. That to now be looking at people who call themselves originalists, I mean, maybe that's among the things that makes it so painful, saying that the founders intended for this one individual to be above the law and unscrutable by even the Supreme Court has washed their hands. I mean, it's chilling. It's chilling and baffling.
And I love what you said because, I think we need to get back to that really anti-monarchical, anti-aristocracy mindset. As you say, the King's Minuet dance became Congress Minuet. They're like, purge the word king and queen from our language. And now it's kind of crept back in pop culture even. Mm-hmm. Like you look at... I
live in LA. We got the LA Kings, baby. I mean, that's our, we were like, and a hockey, very kingly.
That is hilarious. Yes, change it to the LA Congress people. Come on.
Very popular. We're also very popular right now.
Good point. Well, I also look at Disney. They are the biggest propagandists for monarchy ever. It's these princes and princesses. I mean, let's get democracy to Disney.
That's right. I think that'll be your next book. I
would love it. I did write them a letter. I said, change it to the Magic Republic or Magic Democracy, not the Magic Kingdom. and I never responded.
That's unfortunate. Maybe, I'm sure it maybe got lost in the mail. Maybe they were sending it back via an 18th century postal postal service. Oh, that was
Great
one of the
point.
things. You at the end of every chapter, you give a list of like your huzzas and your grievances, the things that you have taken from this exploration of an amendment or an article, what you think is worth cherry picking and preserving, what you liked, and then what was not so great and what you didn't like. And one of the things that you did was send letters to people like Disney, because it was your constitutional right to let people know when they are falling short of their constitutional duties. And can you tell us about the letter that you wrote to Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Oh, I would love to. I mean, first of all, I loved writing letters because they were good for dealing with rage. Like, I think, the social media, the enrage to engage model is very dangerous to our democracy. So it's much harder to be that angry when you take out your quill and you dip it in ink and you have to put the wax in. It's like it slows you down. I don't think we all need to go back to quills, but as you say, handwriting or just
nice.
working offline. Oh, I love it. Yeah. I love the sound, the scratch. There are a lot of ASMR videos of people writing with a quill. Like it's
I get that. I can get that. Yeah.
It's the scratchy sound. But yeah, so Marjorie Taylor Greene has, it's not clear whether she's originalist. I don't know if she's thought about it.
I'm not sure. I suspect you've done a slightly more research into the Constitution than she has.
I think that's a fair statement. She said at one point that abortion is not in the Constitution, therefore it is not a right. So that is sort of a parody of an originalist point of view, that it has to be in their Constitution or it's not protected. So I wrote her, I said, it seems like you might be an originalist based on statements like this. Now, if you are a really hardcore originalist, you should know that the Constitution never mentions that women should be allowed to run for Congress or for president. It's all the he pronoun. And he then did not mean, it wasn't like a universal pronoun to me.
Right.
He, she, they.
Right.
It was he. Like that's who they
The
meant.
guy. Yeah.
And this has never been changed. The 19th Amendment says women can vote, but it never says women can run for office. So if you are a hardcore originalist, you could make the argument that women should not run for office. And so I said, just as an alert, in case you do want to follow this through to its logical conclusion, you might want to not run for Congress next time. And again, as with Disney, I never heard back.
It
from,
may
Congressperson.
Could be in the mail still. I mean, but that is also one of the things when you talk about, like, I love the scratching and how it slows down my thoughts and makes me less rageful. But you point out something that I remember from my letter writing days pre-email, which is how confusing it is when you're trying to start a new conversation and you don't know if they've already received your previous correspondence and perhaps have already sent an answer to this. And as a historian myself who goes through a lot of these contemporary documents, a lot of them start with, I don't know if you received my last message. Perhaps you have already answered this. If so, I hope you can take it into account. Or it starts with, as I write this is what I know about you. I have not received any correspondence, so I really hope that there is no point in sending this. It is such a huge bulk of the correspondence that your grievance at the end is like, still better to be able to see those little 3 dots when you know that they're...
I mean, it is hilarious. Yes, like you say, the Thomas Jefferson and John Adams letters are hilarious because just like you say, it's like, I sent a letter on April 3rd. I don't know if you got it. I haven't gotten it back, but in case you didn't, here's what I said. So yes, there are advantages to texting. There are huge disadvantages, but there are advantages. And also, I mean, it had huge impacts on history because there were things, it took so long. I know that I can't remember which battles. I think there was a New Orleans battle in the War of 1812, but fact check that, please. But that happened after the treaty had been signed because it takes so long they didn't know the treaty had been signed. It takes a few days for it to get to the troops. So it was a weird time lapse with information, and we take for granted again how much instantaneous information has an effect on our lives.
Yeah, and the flip side of that too is the realization of how important it is then when you get all of those individuals in a room together. That the very technological fact that you suck all the air out of those delays and lapses that they were so accustomed to in their communication to just talk meant that this was such a powerful moment. If you weren't there, man, those steps, the many slips between the cups and them lips, baby, is going to mean you just don't get a say anymore. You weren't there. If you choose not to come, if someone prevents you from coming, that it is so much more of a kneecapping than our contemporary, I think, minds can really comprehend.
Well, that's such a great point. Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson, he had what we call FOMO because he was in France and he got the Constitution sent to him. And he said, there are some parts I love, some parts I hate, but I wish I could have been there. And I do think this freedom to assemble, which is right there in the First Amendment, is kind of an appreciated right. And this idea of assembling in person, I did try. I held a dinner party where I invited people from all over the political spectrum, and I do have a couple conservative friends, even though I live on the Upper West Side of New York, and I invited them. I invited libertarians and liberals, and it was fascinating. We had, by the way, 18th century food, which beef stew with a lot of cloves. Everything had cloves. Just obsessed with cloves.
Obsessed with cloves.
Enough with the cloves. But we talked seriously about the flaws and virtues of the Constitution. And we didn't agree on everything, of course, but one thing we did agree on is we should do more of these. Get together in person and have discussions. And I can't imagine, like, if the Constitution were written remotely over a Google Doc, we wouldn't have a country.
No. And it's not doing well to the country that we have presently. I was shocked at something you point out, which is the restrictions on speech that were present, not just at the time of the colonial founders, but in the time they are forging these documents. And some of the specific examples that you give were the kind of speech that was restricted were profanity and blasphemy, the theater, what kinds of shows you could do, especially I remember because Shakespeare was very popular and was the epitome of Englishness. And so there was a lot of like, how dare you try to perform Shakespeare? That's just too English. Yeah. The restrictions on advertisements and certain agreements on Sunday that the punishment for damning a soldier was more serious than slapping a soldier. I mean, these are restrictions on the freedom of speech that I think from our founding fathers that I think a lot of contemporary people would be on their heels to hear. I
was so surprised and fascinated by this. And as part of living it, I did try to instill some of the 1790s New York laws, like 37.5-cent fine for my teenage kids when they would curse or blaspheme. That didn't work out well because they were like, oh, I don't have a half cent. So it was not. But what was fascinating is, yes, how different the First Amendment and many of the other rights were back then. Back then, rights were seen in a different way. They were not seen as these absolutist trump cards. They were seen as, yes, you have rights you're born with, but once you enter into society, you have this social contract. You have to balance your individual rights against the good of society. Mm-hmm. And that meant a lot of our rights back then were much more constrained. I am so grateful. I love free speech as it's practiced now. but that didn't come about until the 1940s and after. It was much more constrained. Those examples you mentioned, obscenity laws in many states, sedition was big. I mean, John Adams had the Alien and Seditions Act, which were not renewed when Jefferson came in, but a lot of people on that side saw no constitutional problem with them because it was just that the country was in its infancy. It was seen as so fragile. It's like, we got to look out for the greater good, and you can't just say anything you want willy-nilly. You have so the Federalists, which were sort of the more conservatives, like, your freedom of speech is you can go to a coffee house or a tavern, have a civil, polite discussion. Maybe if you're really angry, write a letter to the editor at your newspaper, and that's it, and go home and follow the law. So yeah, these rights were very different, and I'm thankful that they have evolved. Neither side, the progressives or the conservatives, would want to go back to that original First Amendment as it was practiced. And conservatives, the idea of that donors, political donors, like the whole Citizens United, that the founders, according to most of the scholars I talked to, would be like, that's not free speech. That's not protected by the First Amendment. No way. They were very concerned about corruption in politics and money in politics. So neither side wants to return to that originalist free speech as it was practiced back then, which was not really free. It was constrained.
Totally. And I think that if you, to your point, you're having your dinner party and you have many people with differing opinions around you, a good example, another example from this time frame and from your book that would balance this, somebody being, the founding fathers actually did restrict individual speech much more than we did, is also to remind them that the right to bear arms was restricted by the government way more than it was now. I mean, you describe how it was much more a responsibility to bear arms because we, the state, will tell you where to take that gun, who to point it at, and it better be fucking clean and ready to fire. I mean, the balance of, like, when this really originalist idea about guns come in, I found myself, for lack of a better term, armed with information from your book as a way to sort of point out, if you really want to go originalist, then you better get ready for a regulator and an inspector to come into your home and guarantee your gun is functioning properly. This is entirely different than the government can't even see my application for a gun. It's like, boy, oh, howdy. You got to pick a lane, man. You're either doing it the way they wanted us to do it, right? Or you're saying, let's evolve with the times. Things aren't like they used to be. Which is
right. That is such a good point. And a lot of this research, by the way, comes from a scholar named Saul Cornell. He's at Fordham. And yeah, as you say, he points out there was more government regulation of guns than less. So pro-gun people would hate the original Second Amendment. Now, anti-gun people or pro-gun control people would also hate it because it was a very militaristic. Everyone, you had to have a gun. It was your civic duty. So neither side, again, wants to go back to that original conception of the Second Amendment for different reasons.
Which is almost how you know it's good. If it actually makes everybody mad. If actually people who agree on nothing can both agree that it's bullshit. You go, look at us. Look at us. Everybody in here is nodding. Can we just start with that?
Great point.
Also, in your book, you talk about shame-based punishment, which I think is, we have such a new level of shame now with canceling people and bringing up things from the ancient past, giving people no opportunity to themselves have a living personal constitution, which is, oh yes, that was what I thought once, but I have evolved in my thinking. There's no revisionist, But you, in order to sort of fully flex on this, get a pillory in your house, and God bless Julie has, I imagine, the joy and satisfaction of putting you in the pillory so you could experience what that was like. I'd like to know if you still have it
I do.
Does everybody
Well, yes,
have a turn?
This was a fascinating part because this was all about, as you say, punishment. And the 8th Amendment of the Constitution says no cruel and unusual punishments. But what does that mean? Because back then in 1789, it was not considered cruel to flog people or brand people or put them in the pillory, which is where you have wooden holes for your hands and head, and you would go in there. And it was not a joke. Like, people would throw rocks at you. Oof. They would manure dead animals, and you would, it was not like a cutesy thing. It was horrible. And even Antonin Scalia, who's a former Supreme Court justice, one of the founders of originalism, he said in a famous essay that if you are super committed, if you take originalism really seriously, then you have to accept that pillories are not cruel or unusual, because they were not cruel or unusual in 1789. Other originalists say that's not true. That's a bad argument. But that is Scalia's point. So I thought, well, I should at least explore this idea of a pillory. So I went on, and on Etsy, you can buy pillories. They are more for adult entertainment than for, and you can get them custom made.
Great.
So I got mine from a place in France. It's beautiful. It's wooden. You can also I had the choice of, do I want neoprene padding around the neck hole? And I was like, that doesn't seem comfortable.
Yeah.
You don't want.
Do you have any sandpaper?
Exactly. So I didn't. I got my pillory in the mail a few weeks later. And I was originally planning, like, maybe I should offer it to my kids. If they do something wrong, I'll say 5 minutes in the pillory or no screens for a day. But I couldn't do that. I could not bring myself to. I'm too much of a softie. So the only one I was willing to put in the pillory was myself. So I did, and I didn't want my kids anywhere near, because I knew they would leave me in there.
Yes.
And I had my wife. And she
might also leave you in there. That was a roll of the dice.
And she did. She used it, and she was like, I'll let you out if you promise to fold your sweaters, that kind of thing. So it was not a huge success. I still have it. I haven't used it in quite some time, but it is under my bed if anyone needs it.
If anyone I think it's just nice. It's not as easy to pull out and threaten someone with. I imagine it's more bulky, but it's probably kind of nice to just be able to reach there and let people know it's possible.
I don't think anyone is intimidated, but it is there.
We also, we touched on this a little bit with the Supreme Court, but, and I'm sure, there's a space of time between when you wrote this book, when the book was published, and of course to you and I talking, but boy, howdy, has the Supreme Court left some steamers out there for us lately. And I was particularly moved, you were describing how, in our checks and balances that the founders said, the Supreme Court is third among equals, and was so weak that in one of its earliest renditions, slightly before the 1800s, there was the central bank was being established, and the president and the Congress had both agreed. So the Supreme Court didn't even rule in on it. It was like, well, it looks like it's 2 out of 3, bitches. I don't matter what I think, because we already have a majority, versus where we are now, where the president agrees, the Congress agrees, and the majority of the people agree, and the Supreme Court sort of shuffles in and can do whatever they want. It is a shocking shift from what an originalist may have expected, and that this change was brought about by people who claim to be originalists is even more stunning. It is stunning. I mean, there are a lot of things I'm glad we moved away from the founding era. It's less sexist and less racist than it was. But in some aspects, I think we need to get back to. And one of them is that Congress was
supposed to be the main power because that's who's closest to the people, not the president. So the president's way too powerful, and Supreme Court is out of control.
What the hell?
The founders would be like, what? They saw this. I don't want to use the word run to the litter, but it was pretty much, it was third among third. It was a very short article in the Constitution. And like you said, early on, the state of Georgia was sued by a merchant, and they didn't even show up. They didn't even send a lawyer to the Supreme Court. They're like, it's not
These
worth
idiots,
it.
who cares?
Yeah, who cares?
It's a lowercase s.
Right.
Who cares?
Who cares? And they rarely, John Marshall overturned one congressional, famously congressional rule, but it was so rare. There were only 3 occasions like that before the Civil War. Now it happens all the time where the Supreme Court overrules Congress. And it is not the way the founders would have liked. These are 9 unelected people.
Lifetime appointments.
Lifetime. Exactly. And that is, lifetime back then was not nearly as long. So that's why I think there is bipartisan support for an 18-year term. But yeah, the Supreme Court has grown so powerful. Back then, the idea was the Supreme Court did have judicial review, meaning they could weigh in on what is and is not constitutional. But the other branches did too. The president, it was a little messy, but it was much more equal. Now they have what is called judicial supremacy, that they are seen as the final arbiter on everything that is and is not constitutional. And to have these 9 unelected people have so much power over where we go to school, over what we do with our bodies or what we carry, and it is just insane. And especially, like, I barely understand I don't understand the internet. It's way too complicated. But having someone like Clarence Thomas, who's, having him someone that old who's so far into that technology and making these super consequential decisions on internet technology is just baffling and wrong.
It is totally baffling and wrong. If nothing else, it does sort of led some credence to the idea that maybe a plurality in the presidency wouldn't be the greatest solution. That you can have 9 individuals fuck it up all at once, and 8 and 12 and 1. I mean, I also think about, the triumphant in France and how, having 3 or having a multitude at the top is great until they start stabbing each other in the back too and fighting for which too. So, how do we get to the root of it? I mean, you bring up a great example where how the Constitution and some of these amendments work well when they address the foundational problem and less well when they address specifics. For example, a price gouging. There was a problem with barbers price gouging, and that they were just charging way too much for a haircut. And so the rule was you can't charge more than 50 cents for a haircut. And that seems at the moment to fix it. But if the rule is you can't charge more than 50 cents for a haircut, 240 years later, there can be no barbers. No one can exist because the rule says you can't charge more than 50 cents, and that doesn't make any sense anymore. It doesn't work. Whereas if they had addressed price gouging, which is much more difficult, has more flexible lines, is more difficult to define, the problem may have been more admirably solved,
I love that. Yeah. I think that is the best way to use the Constitution as at this very high level as a sort of moral North Star. So phrases like blessings of liberty, equal protection under the law, due process, take those at the very high level. But if you do start to try to get the Constitution to be specific about and that was one of the big problems with prohibition. That should not have been in the Constitution, and of course,
and it wasn't for long.
Yeah, it wasn't for long. So stick to the high level, and of course, one of the big issues, one of the big debates is how much do you evolve phrases like equal protection, which is in the 14th Amendment. And I am of the belief that our morals do evolve. So now the 14th Amendment should apply to gay people and gay rights and gay marriage. If you are a super hardcore originalist like Clarence Thomas, he says, no, actually, the 14th Amendment, they wrote it in the 1860s. They were not thinking about gay rights. Therefore, it does not apply to gay marriage. So again, it's how flexible should the Constitution be?
God, and it's so, it is those alternates. I feel like similar to reading the Bible, where you go from fist clenching frustration to ceiling raising admiration, all at once.
Yeah, it's emotional whiplash. Like some parts are just like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. I can't believe they agreed to it. And then, like, what?
Which is what brings me to, and your book does it so elegantly. One of the simplest and most beautiful things from the 18th century that you brought back, which is the election cake.
Thank you for bringing that up. That was my favorite part.
Much.
Yes.
I love it so much. Tell us, what is an election cake and how this specific artifact from the 18th century, you and I both agree, preserve. Let's enumerate this one and hold it close.
Yes, this should be in the Constitution. This should be spelled out. Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, so as I talk about in the book, that 18th century elections, we don't want to go back because, black people couldn't vote and women couldn't vote. But there are aspects that are worth looking at again. And one was for those who were privileged enough to vote, it was amazing. What an awe-inspiring new right to be able to choose your own leaders.
Look at
it's
us.
like mind-blowing. Yeah. And it was a festival. It wasn't a chore. It was a festival. You had parades and music and farmers markets. It was like Coachella. It was like, woo.
Yes.
And they had rum, lots of rum punch
drinking.
and cakes. They had these election cakes. So people would bake cake and bring it to the polls. And just to remind people that democracy is sweet. That was sort of the catchphrase. I don't know if it was, but I made it the catchphrase. And then I said, this is so nice. We've got to do this because we've got to remind ourselves that democracy is sweet. So I went on Facebook, which I know is not very 18th century, but it is one of the older platforms.
It
right?
is,
So
and it's a communal. Sure, you're
sure.
sure.
So I said, can we bring back the election cake? And I got people in all 50 states, hundreds of people around the country who were wonderful and enthusiastic and baked these cakes, brought them either to their work or to their family or to the polls. And it was weirdly emotional for me, and from judging by the emails, for a lot of people, because it was this positive this actual action that you could take that was positive in this very, very negative, depressing time. And I don't think, I'm not deluded, I don't think cake is the solution, but I call it a gateway carb. It's like, let's get people excited about elections again, and then do some real reforms on gerrymandering or on ranked choice voting or whatever. But get people, and so it was lovely, and people wrote the nice, and also it showed, what I loved is you could use the original recipe, which again, a lot of cloves, but I didn't say you had to. So people were very creative, and they did it based on their state. So Georgia had a peach cake, and Maine had one with a lobster, not a real lobster, like a candy lobster. And it was just so, and we shared them all on Facebook, and it was such a communal bonding experience that I am doing it again.
Yes.
So if people please contact me, and let's do it again. We got about 250 last time. I'm hoping for 500 or even 1,000.
Oh, good. And I will have links to AJ and his book, of course, and his social media media and just Facebook so you can see the cakes and find recipes and get in on this, because I intend this November I'm going to drink.
In?
I'm going to day drink, and I'm definitely making an election cake 100%. I'll probably use cloves. Why not? Let's get
why
weird.
not?
I might add some cannabis. California, but George Washington did, suggest that everybody grow it. So
Great idea.
Thanks.
I love that.
Thanks.
And yes, I used cloves as well. Just a hint. They're not so bad but I am so in moderation. I'm so excited that you will be baking a cake. So I'm thrilled
100%,
to have
100%.
you on the team.
Oh my gosh. Well, this has been so great. We could talk all day. I would come to your dinner party. I'd wear a tricorn hat. I'd do the whole thing. But before we say goodbye, there was a through line through your book that I have also hearkened back to several times since I finished reading it. And it is about Benjamin Franklin's observation of the back of George Washington's chair and the engraving that was there. And I wonder if you would tell us the story of that engraving and how Benjamin Franklin saw it.
Yes. So I love this story because at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, George Washington had this big wooden chair, and on the back was a carving of a sun. But it wasn't the whole sun. It was just the top half. And the bottom half was cut off by the horizon. So you couldn't tell. Is the sun rising? Is it setting? You couldn't tell. And at the end of the convention, when they had finally created this, against all odds, this agreement, Ben Franklin said, "Now I know that the sun is rising. The sun is rising on America, on the Republic, on democracy." I love that story. So, and part of the point of the book was how is the sun still rising on democracy? Because you look around and you get all this negative news, and it seems like maybe it's not rising at all. Maybe this is the end. But I do believe the sun can still rise on democracy, but it's not like the actual sun. It doesn't do it by gravity. It's not a natural force. We have to be the ones who raise that sun up. And I do think we can. I think there are practical things we can do to ensure our democracy. One is voting, baking cakes, but there's lots of other stuff if you get involved. So that I was, as you said at the beginning, I am optimistic with an asterisk that we can preserve democracy and it can continue to thrive. Fingers crossed.
I agree with you. And as someone who has the name Dawn, exactly. This is the dawning man, and I am optimistic about our Constitution, and I am optimistic about our union, and it is in large part because of the work of people like you, AJ, who not just dive into our troublesome waters, but show us how you can keep your head above the surface and make it a joyful thing to do. Because I think one of the most insidious elements to action that prevents us from doing exactly what you described, which is help push that sun up, is frustration and defeatism and a feeling of being either alone or completely overpowered. And I think that your wit and your intelligence are like that sun. And it's just a real joy to know about you and to spend this time with you. I am so grateful.
I loved it. Thank you, Dawn. And right back at you. What you are doing is instilling joy in looking at history and chasing away the nihilism and defeatism. So I super appreciate it. I'm a big fan.
Did you hear that? AJ Jacobs is a big fan of me. Oh, I'm dead. And of course, I am a huge fan of his. And if you haven't already, go check out his book. Okay, it is exactly what you need right now to buoy your spirits and encourage your action. His social media, his book, and how to make your own election cake this year can be found in the show notes. As for us, we'll be back in just 2 short weeks with our next new episode, which is on one of America's most beloved and controversial monuments, Mount Rushmore. The story is nuts, the engineering is batshit, and the sculptor behind it, you guys, you're gonna love it. Okay, my guest is storyteller extraordinaire Christine Blackburn, and you won't want to miss it. Until we meet again, our theme song was composed and performed by the incomparable Kat Perkins. A reminder that you can find my sources, links to the books, documentaries, and articles I reference in the summary of this episode, or by emailing us hilfpodcast@gmail.com or messaging on social media @hilfpodcast. This has been HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck with Dawn Brody. I'm Dawn Brody, reminding you that history is a party, and everybody's coming.